What about legal drugs? What about alcohol and nicotine? What do they do for the system? Are they any good or are they impractical?
Interesting. Okay, that's a very interesting question. On my shaman's course at the end of year 1 and at the end of year 2, we were provided with a fairly large amount of alcohol and chocolate, deliberately by the teacher, because he wanted to shut us down, because we've been doing a lot of very deep work indeed. So this is the answer to alcohol. Alcohol does have a use, shamanically, and that is if you need to shut yourself down, if you've been doing lots of really amazing work and you need to bring yourself right back thoroughly into the third dimension and switch off all your abilities, that's what you want to do. Highly recommended in that context. Tobacco, different story, because you use the word nicotine. I will not answer any question about nicotine because, well, I could. I'd say nicotine is an extremely poisonous substance and I wouldn't go near it with a barge pole. However, I have great respect for the tobacco plant and I have great respect for people who smoke tobacco. And I think tobacco has a very important use, particularly in our society today. And I find it criminal that our society is actually progressively taking steps to make tobacco more and more difficult for people to consume. They're not making it illegal, but they're doing just about everything they can to discourage people. And I feel it's one of the ways we've been conned in our society. It's ever so interesting if you look at certain societies where a lot of tobacco is smoked, and you look at their incidence of cancer. I'm particularly thinking of Native Americans, I'm also thinking of Central American and South American shamans, and I'm also thinking of people who live in Japan. It's a well-known fact that the incidence of lung cancer in Japan is all-time low, and yet the Japanese smoke really large amounts of tobacco. There's a bit of a con going on here, which is linking lung cancer and smoking tobacco. This is what I'd say. I would say that if you create a society whereby you do everything you can to program people into the idea that smoking tobacco is going to give them a disease, then the power of the word will win out eventually, because people become brainwashed by the idea, they become completely programmed by it and convinced by it because they hear the ideas being repeated over and over endlessly in all the media. Smoking equals these illnesses, smoking equals those illnesses. Unsurprisingly, eventually it's going to start to form a bit of a link. If you start to look at the way tobacco is used in other cultures, it becomes very, very interesting indeed. Tobacco has got a use shamanically, and it's a protection device. If you are working with dodgy entities, if you're working with clients who've taken really difficult pharmaceutical drugs like heroin and so on, then the one thing you could do with doing is you need to make really sure that you're protected. Now there are other methods. The use of sage, burning sage, is particularly good as a protective, but tobacco is really the par excellence method for protection, and it's used by shamans all over the world as protection. And there are certain parts of the world, particularly Central and South America, where the shamans smoke huge quantities of incredibly strong tobacco and they don't get any of these illnesses that people get in the West. There is something else to say as well, which is actually, it's not just a matter of tobacco, it's like what kind of tobacco, who has processed it and what have they done to process it. It's a very sad fact, but most British tobacco is amongst the most polluted, adulterated and poisoned tobacco on the planet. It's even worse than a lot of the American tobaccos, and it's infinitely worse than the French tobaccos. If you do wish to smoke tobacco, I would heartily recommend you go for the tobaccos which are free of additives. Now if you live in the United Kingdom, there are only two available I know of. One is called Natural American Spirit and the other one is called Pueblo. Natural American Spirit is available from all branches of Oddbins, the off-licence. Increasingly the mainstream supermarkets like Tesco's, Waitrose and Sainsbury's are now stocking this particular brand. There are some tobacconists that sell the other brand, Pueblo. They're both without additives, which means that you are not putting a load of poisons into your body. What you're putting into your body is tobacco, which is historically, and even in the present day where people are not brainwashed against it, one of the best forms of protection available. Now I'm talking about psychic protection, protection against entities, protection against demonic forces, even protection against dark magic. It's excellent. So this brings me to what I would regard to my issue about the slightly sinister aspect, because if I was wanting to control people in the society and I was wanting to feed them my ideas, then one thing I would do is I would definitely make tobacco more difficult for them to consume, because that way my agenda would be more easily pursued. And I have a feeling that's really the reason why there's the smoking ban. It's nothing to do with health, it's to do with people being manipulated. So much respect to those people who do smoke tobacco. You have a lot of advantages from doing so. I find in my life there are times I choose to smoke, I choose not to smoke. At the moment I'm having great enjoyment from not smoking, and who knows how long it will last, but I have found that periods of smoking, periods of non-smoking, both very useful.
Right, well, let's move on to perhaps the highest or the second highest consumed drug in the world, caffeine.
Oh, caffeine, gosh.
And everything from soft drinks to coffee to Red Bull. Is it an amphetamine kind of stimulant? Is it kind of a diuretic? What is all this about caffeine?
Interesting point. Well, I think I need to distinguish between how a caffeine affects me and how a caffeine affects other people, because there seems to be a very, very big difference. I personally avoid consuming caffeine completely because I'm very sensitive to it. I think it might have a little bit to do with when I was 19, I was occupying the arts block of my university, and I spent an entire weekend doing nothing but drinking coffee of the really rubbish quality instant variety, and ever since then I've been so sensitised against it that it's something I can't actually do without having very strong effects. Generally speaking, I notice a lot of people are very attracted to caffeine. It seems to have a lot of good benefits for people in terms of enabling them to be more sociable, to get the ideas flowing quicker. If you go back into history and remember that the bean was brought across from other parts of the world to Europe, and we had an explosion of coffee houses and tea houses in the Middle Ages as these two beverages were consumed for the first time. And it was a real shock for the whole society, because at that point the society had been living on effectively ale, which is very weak beer without any hops in, and pretty much everyone consumed ale as a matter of course throughout their day. The water in those days was so polluted they were risking getting cholera from drinking it, so by turning it into ale that meant that they were decontaminating the water. So everyone was in a situation of low-grade alcoholism. So if you can imagine an entire society of low-grade alcoholics, suddenly they go to drinking tea and coffee. It was mind-blowing. It actually created the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, just consuming those two plants. So incredibly powerful. Now you move on to World War II, and you have a situation where, like a cup of tea, love, the world's just blown up. Like a cup of tea, love, I've just had me terrible news that me 3 children have been killed. Whatever it was, always the answer was have a cup of tea, and then as time moves on, have a cup of coffee. So it's been used as a bit of a panacea, and my feeling about our culture was we moved from a culture that was low-grade alcoholics to basically amphetamine heads. And I think that, generally speaking, most people are, to a greater or lesser extent, mildly addicted to caffeine and caffeine-related beverages. As you quite rightly said, there's Coca-Cola, there's Red Bull, there's all these other drinks which also contain the caffeine. So even if you don't drink tea and coffee, you might still be consuming the substance. Now, from what I have discovered over long periods of use, it does put a strain on the organs of the body, particularly the heart, the liver and the kidneys. And so I think that if you are to become a really regular, every single day consumer, you're going to start to get the long-term disadvantages. And here's where I think that caffeine and amphetamine are so closely related, because I do know people who consume amphetamine as well as caffeine, and what I've discovered from listening to them many, many times is this: if you consume caffeine or amphetamine, what you get is you get a short-term benefit which makes you feel good and you're able to think really quickly and have amazing conversations, and then you get the long-term drawback. Now if it's amphetamine, the long-term drawback hits you like the following day. If you're talking about something like, say, coffee or tea, the long-term drawback might hit you a few years down the line. So it really is a matter of personal opinion and personal preference, these things. And my personal choice is I'm really glad that I don't need to consume such substances, but I do understand that a lot of people get a lot of benefits and a lot of enjoyment from drinking them.